Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. What's the importance and relevance of the becoming-being distinction to us? The previous video was all about the fundamental becoming-being distinction. What, though, does that have to do with living well emotionally? How does it relate even to living well? Again, it's a distinction that really goes beyond discursive reason. It's impossible to understand conceptually. Guess what? So is your own nature, isn't it? Have you ever seriously struggled with the answer to, who am I? If you think you have a satisfactory conceptual answer to it, you don't. Why? As human beings, we have a dual nature. It's as if we stand with one foot in becoming and one foot in being. Therefore, because we are both becoming and being, and because the becoming-being distinction goes beyond discursive reason, understanding our nature also goes beyond discursive reason. That explains a lot, doesn't it? If you've ever had an identity crisis, from this perspective, it's now easy to understand how it was even possible and why it was so difficult. If so, it now becomes obvious that really understanding ourselves requires opening to being. Opening to being requires dropping conceptual thought. No thought is required for getting the becoming-being distinction. Dropping thought isn't easy, yet it's required for directly experiencing our own nature. How could we live well without directly experiencing our own nature? As long as we don't open to being, we stay stuck on the for me that, as we've seen, is the heart of every emotion. Therefore, opening to being is essential for freedom from emotional bondage. This explains why most human beings are stuck being bound emotionally. They never experience genuine emotional peace. Most human beings live most of their lives wholly stuck in becoming. That's not only sad, but it's unnecessary. However, it's also true that most human beings have at least occasional experiences of being which seem spontaneous. Since we are both matter and spirit, it's impossible for anyone who lives wholly immersed in becoming to live a fulfilled life. Fulfillment requires realizing our nature as both matter and spirit. Since everyone already understands living and becoming, the task of living a fulfilled life becomes opening to being. Opening to being balances becoming and being. It heals the split between the two sides of our nature. Opening to being is what sages do that non-sages fail to do. Again, being cannot be thought. It cannot be apprehended conceptually. It can only be apprehended directly via no thought, by dropping all conceptualizations. Even just a glimpse of being is called spiritual awakening. The idea of opening to being serves as motivation for spiritual practices such as aliveness, awareness, or zazen, which we covered previously in this series. All spiritual yogic practices are bodily. Our word spiritual comes from the Latin spiritus, which means a breath or wind. It's only bodies that breathe. The point of spiritual practices is, to use Roshi Kapleau's term, to free us from incessant, endless, usually useless thoughting. Explaining exactly why this is so beneficial requires explaining the becoming-being distinction, which is impossible. The best way to refer to being is simply to emulate the Buddha and describe it by negating becoming. For example, since becoming is the domain of death, being is the deathless. Many spiritual teachers, of course, try to use words to direct our attention towards being. There are lots of books by spiritual teachers that are helpful, including, for example, David R. Hawkins's The Eye of the I. There are two important mistakes to avoid. First, pay attention to what sages themselves have said or written rather than to what their followers have said or written. Recall the energy scale briefly described earlier in this series. It arbitrarily goes from 0, absence of energy, to 1,000. In reality, energy goes from no energy to infinite energy. A scale that large has no practical value. The highest rated humans, like the Buddha and Jesus Christ, rate it 1,000. Naturally, there's a drop-off among their followers. This is why Nietzsche wrote in The Antichrist, "The very word Christianity is a misunderstanding. In truth, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross." Kaufman's translation. Although it's commonly misunderstood, Nietzsche thought highly of Jesus. Compare my blog post at dennis-bradford.com/Nietzsche's-evaluation-of-Christ. It was his inauthentic followers he despised. Again, though, this can be difficult because the Buddha and Jesus didn't write any books, and all we have are reports of what they supposedly said, which have been passed along for many years. It's often extremely helpful to rely on interviews, talks, and writings by recent and contemporary sages who are widely admired, such as Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Thich Nhat Hanh, Philip Kapleau, David Hawkins, and Eckhart Tolle. The danger is letting study replace spiritual practice. Let study increase your motivation to practice rather than be a substitute for it. The second mistake is related to studying too much. Avoid trying to think your way to being. Again, it's logically impossible for thought to apprehend being. If you don't have a coach or a guide already, consider talking with a sage or senior practitioner, especially if you are new to spiritual practice. Again, if you might want me as your coach, and I'm still offering it, go to endfearfast.com and sign up for a free consultation. Even if we turn out to be mismatched, perhaps I can point you in a direction that will work well for you. Of course, if you were an expert, you wouldn't need to look for one. If you are not an expert, how can you recognize one? That's a problem in every field. In the next video, I offer you a method that you may find very helpful for solving that problem. Let's end emotional distress.